Now, you may remember a few years ago, I covered a film by the name of In Search of Darkness, a 4.5 hour love letter encyclopedia documentary created by David Weir that aimed to explore the 1980s horror cinema scene, from everything from discussions of Final Girls to how horror was reactionary to the current state of politics at the time. It is very much an exploration of what the 80s horror scene was. And since then, they have created In Search of Darkness Part 2 and is aiming to finally finish its third film in the In Search of Darkness trilogy, which I am heavily anticipating. But before they can even do that, they released In Search of Tomorrow. In Search of Tomorrow is very similar to something like In Search of Darkness, an encyclopedia-esque documentary that explores excessively the genre of sci-fi in 1980s pop culture, from everything from Saturn III to Mad Max, from Miracle Mile to Cocoon. Even your favorites are here. Empire Strikes Back, Back to the Future, The Last Starfighter, Tron. I can go on forever. The list is exhaustive, and it left me wanting to type out a whole list of films that is mentioned in this documentary that I will end up probably watching. Again, things like Last Starfighter and Cocoon and Saturn III, I haven't seen those movies, but a lot of the other ones I have. I think one of the wisest things that this film does is that because there's so much like very famous films that they have in the 1980s in terms of sci-fi, like Empire Strikes Back or Tron, they don't end up ultimately spending too much time focusing on the making of those movies, because there's plenty of documentaries about the making of The Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. They wisely don't talk about those films because they end up having to discuss some of those aspects later on in the segments, such as, say, makeup and VFX, or special effects, or landscapes. There's a lot of different topics that they discuss in the in-between segments between years. And this is where we get to the general structure of the film. It's very similar to In Search of Darkness, where it has the intro. They start off with the first year, which is 1980, and then they have the in-between segments after every year. So it's like 1980 segment, 1981 segment. And each of these segments brings a lot of different things to think about in terms of how to contextualize the 1980s and its reaction to the Cold War and technology and government, and there's a lot of things that it discusses, and I really enjoy that. If you are a 1980s sci-fi film lover, or are just interested to see what other sci-fi films there were besides the usual suspects, this is a film for you. I ended up making a list of films that I had never seen that I actually do want to see. I've actually purchased The Last Starfighter, and it's on its way to my house at this point in time. But yeah, In Search of Tomorrow is very similar to In Search of Darkness, and there's not really much I could really say that elevates this above it or even below it. It's on the same level of quality, but it does have a lot of great interviews. It does have more great interviews. However, I do wish there was more like people that were involved from the YouTube community, because in things like In Search of Darkness, you had people like Dead Meat or Cinemassacre. Oliver Harper is in this one, but as far as like other YouTubers or even online personalities that are big fans of 80s sci-fi, there's not a lot of them here. But I will say, in fairness, there is a nice trade-off, because you do have various amounts of film historians and plenty of people that were actually working on those films that end up bringing a lot more personality and a lot more introspection into those films that we discuss in this documentary. But suffice to say, In Search of Tomorrow is another great excessive in a good sense, by the way. It's another great, excessive in a good way, documentary that is very much a love letter to the genre, and it made me think at times about the role of what sci-fi can do. It's actually pretty inspiring, honestly. And as someone who is a filmmaker and trying to write their own sci-fi pieces, this definitely left me with a lot of things to think about and a lot of film recommendations that I can personally look at and see if I can get inspiration from those things. And that's pretty cool. And that's honestly a win from me. Also, another thing of note is the documentary score. There's a lot of pretty great banging songs that are very much influenced from 1980s techno music, but at the same time, there's also a lot of variety this time around, which I found very refreshing. And I do enjoy the work of Weary Pines. In fact, I actually have the soundtrack for In Search of Darkness Part 2 that the Weary Pines was giving away. And he also sent me this little this little picture of Pennywise, and says thank you. I thought that was really cool of Weary Pines. But yeah, Weary Pines still knocks it out of the park for documentary like soundtracks. It's pretty cool. And yes, I did also back this film. That's how I was able to see this film early. And I am ultimately going to be getting a box from them in the next month or so that has the physical edition. And I might do an unboxing of that later on, probably in April or May, sometime soon. Not entirely sure when it's going to get to me ultimately, but suffice to say, I've been pretty impressed. Definitely check this out when it gets to VOD or whenever it comes out. Not entirely sure because I was not entirely aware of where it's going to be released. But when it actually ever does get released, definitely check this out because it's really good. It's well crafted, it's well edited, and for a film that was made during the pandemic, it definitely has a lot. It has a lot to give for a film that was made during the pandemic. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to give In Search of Tomorrow an A. Thank you guys so much for watching my review of In Search of Tomorrow. I hope you can check it out soon, whenever it lands on VOD, whenever it gets some sort of physical release. Hopefully, you guys will be able to watch it. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next review. Peace.